The Danish government's announced controversial plans to house some migrants in an asylum centre due to be built on a remote island.
If one is unwanted in Danish society, one cannot be a burden for ordinary Danish people. That's why those who are deported because of crimes will get a new address. That means we will send them to the uninhabited island of Lindholm. They are not wanted in Denmark, and they should feel it.
The plan by the Danish immigration minister has the backing of the centre-right government. The right-wing Danish People's Party posted a video on Twitter where it praised the decision. The video portrayed a man with a Middle Eastern appearance who is left abandoned on the small island. Lindholm Island is located around a kilometre from the mainland, not far from Copenhagen. The only infrastructure there at present is a research centre into contagious animal diseases, some stables and an animal crematorium. The government plans to spend $115 million to build an asylum centre there by 2021. Only certain groups of migrants would be sent to the island. There are people with visas that allow only very restricted movement around the country. Certain types of criminals, including war criminals and those who pose a threat to state security, will find themselves island-bound too. There's no detail on whether the various groups will be isolated from each other or held together. Well, to discuss this now, we're joined by political activist and social justice campaigner George Barder and media commentator Neil Wallace. Thank you both for coming onto the programme to discuss this further. We'll start with you, George. The Danish government says all the necessary conditions will be provided for those kept in asylum. How likely is it that they're going to keep their promise, George?
Well, I think the biggest problem here is that, as usual, you have asylum seekers conflated with criminals. The right-wing media in the UK has jumped on top of this story, and that all the headlines are, foreign convicts to be put on an island, and the Daily Mail, The Sun, that my fellow interlocutor used to work for, and of course only in the sort of small print further down do you find out that it's also any failed asylum seeker, pretty much. So you have this terrifying conflation of people who are fleeing awful circumstances across the world in greater and greater numbers because of the wars that the West is responsible for, and increasingly because of climate change, and increasingly they're being criminalised. And I think a so-called centre-right party, getting into bed with a far-right party and allowing them the opportunity to, put these horrible racist cartoons out there, I think just fuels the flames of this kind of divide and rule, where more and more the social problems in European countries are being blamed on, Muslims generally, and it's not just somebody of Middle Eastern appearance in this cartoon, it's somebody, specifically portrayed as a Muslim. And so this is, I think, a deeply disturbing development from a country that, from the outside, many progressives across the world see as a beacon in many ways for how other countries could be doing things much better in terms of having a decent economy, but also a compassionate society.
Neil, if we look at the Linden facility, and it says that the house will house rejected asylum seekers who have been convicted of crimes, as well as foreign citizens who do not have permission to stay but cannot be deported for legal reasons. So they're in no man's land. How moral is it to allow those who aren't criminals to be in the same facility, as George has rightly pointed out?
Well, I think the idea of conflating morality into this whole debate becomes quite difficult, because what may be moral to worthy chaps like George, who spent his entire life virtue signalling and running around telling the rest of us what we should do, doesn't reflect what the vast majority of people actually think out there. And the reason this government has done this in Denmark is because that's what its people want. And the people of Denmark are fed up with people like George telling them how they should think and what they should think and who they should welcome in to their country, when essentially it comes down to this: if you have no right to be here, if you have broken the rules, if you've entered here and you have broken the rules, then it makes perfect sense for the society you've intruded into to say, no, you stand aside and stand out of our midst while we deal with you.
Neil, you mentioned there that you think that it's what the people want. There are lawyers in Denmark that have said that such a move violates the human rights, erasing the distinction between asylum and prison. How does that back up your comments?
Well, to be honest, there's lawyers everywhere who very happily take taxpayers' money to mount what are vaguely spurious lines like that. I mean, a few jumped-up lawyers telling the majority of people in the country that no, we metropolitans know better than you do, and we look down our nose at you and we tell you what you should think or how you should feel or what your views should be, and listen to us because we're lawyers. Well, the truth of the matter is, as we've seen increasingly across Europe, and we saw here in Britain with Brexit, those people are increasingly telling the soft liberals, the metropolitan elites, the permanent, those people who work permanently for NGOs, they're telling them where to go and take a running jump, frankly.
I want to come back on this. This isn't just a few lawyers saying this. This is virtually all the progressive parties in Sweden. And I think it's rich for Neil Wallis to talk about people like me telling people what to think. And when he worked for a very, very long time for the Murdoch empire, that many people that have a sort of progressive politics, as I see it, recognise to have been a huge part of creating this incredibly divided society in the first place, where the spectacular concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of people like Rupert Murdoch have been used.
Quite
that
clearly,
spectacular
that
concentration of wealth is really the issue, and people like Neil Wallis have told them. Please let me finish my point. I let you speak for.
Neil, let George speak.
Can I speak now, please? Yes, so what I was saying is that the vast concentrations of wealth and power that have happened over the last few decades have been masked, especially by corporate media giants like Rupert Murdoch, for whom Neil Wallis works, who portray the vulnerable people in society, some of the most vulnerable people in this world. We're about 70 million refugees at the moment, and we're headed towards about 200 million by mid-century, and it is a tragedy in the making that Sweden is following places like the UK, where increasingly you're criminalising people who have fled very, very difficult circumstances and just want a decent life. This is not a solution to the problem of immigration, to demonise Muslims.
We're talking about Denmark.
And for a so-called centre-right party to have got into bed with a far-right party on this, I think is deeply tragic. And the real issue is that people everywhere are struggling to meet their daily needs, including the UK and Sweden, because there are vast concentrations of wealth in the hands of people like Rupert Murdoch. And that's really the truth. This is not about virtue signalling. This is about standing up for the most vulnerable people in the world. And this is not a solution.
Neil, let me jump in there.
Is it worth pointing out, George?
Neil,
is it just worth pointing out we're talking about Denmark?
Neil, let me jump in here.
George, facts might be useful.
Neil, this is a fact.
In the UK as well, if you want.
I would like to say, gentlemen, Neil, George mentioned the demonisation of a specific type of people, and the video, and that is a fact, the video that is being used on Twitter is depicting a Middle Eastern-looking man being dumped on an island. What message do you think that is sending to the Danish people and the rest of the world, for that matter?
Well, it's disappointing to think that people can seriously suggest that some video, which I haven't actually seen, but I take your word for it, is going to change the views and somehow greatly affect the people of Denmark, who, let us remember, this is the elected government of Denmark, not Sweden, incidentally, George, that's another country, but it's the democratically elected government of Denmark that has made this decision. It has done it because that's what people want. Now, where George is right in talking about Sweden is because you are seeing similar sorts of swings to about the difficulties of illegal migration, of illegal asylum seekers, and the issues that have raised there by the disruption to Western society of this wholesale engagement of large numbers of people from other parts of the world. That causes stresses. Simply to chant endless cliches about multinationalism does not take away those basic things. People are unhappy, and that's why they've spoken. It's an elected government that has done this.
George, George, I'm going to mention Neil's point there. He said that it's an elected government. They feel they've got a problem, you know, I have to state that when you look at some of the figures, there is a disproportionate number of immigrants making. It's a smaller percentage, obviously, in the country, but they are looking. It looks like they're committing more crimes if you look at those figures. I mean, what's the government meant to do?
Okay, I mean, I think a lot of these figures are portrayed in a very inflammatory way, but the simple fact is that the main places that people are fleeing to Denmark from are places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. Pretty much a map of the countries that we have been bombing, and also, by the way, some of the countries that are most significantly affected by climate change already. And to say that this is a democratic government is sure that's true, and the coalition system there means that the centre-right government has had to include the far right as a kind of kingmaker in its government, and I think that's deeply worrying. But the fact is, we need to see the historical parallels here. When you have spectacular inequality and elites effectively transferring the wealth from everybody else, this happened 100 years ago as well. You know, we had the excesses of the 20s, the financial crash, and then the divide and rule of the 30s, and it led to the same place where some of the most vulnerable people in the world are essentially scapegoated by an establishment media narrative day after day, month after month, year after year, and the Murdoch empire, for which Wallace has worked, has been stoking the flames of this totally misdirected energy. So yes, this is the way people think, and it's deeply unfortunate.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you, George Barder, social justice campaigner, Neil Wallace, media commentator. We've run out of time. Thank you both for coming onto the programme.